The wind whipped dust devils down Main Street as Avery Quinn stood before the courthouse steps, 4 crumpled dollar bills clutched in his weathered palm. The tax auction had drawn maybe a dozen locals, most of them leaning against storefronts with the satisfied air of spectators at a particularly entertaining disaster. "Going once for $4, the auctioneer droned, his voice carrying the weary resignation of a man who'd watched too many dreams sold for pocket change. "Going twice." Avery raised his hand. A ripple of barely suppressed laughter ran through the crowd. Someone behind him muttered, "City fools about to learn why nobody wanted that place." The gavel came down with a sound like breaking bone. "Sold to the gentleman with the generous spirit and questionable judgment." Sheriff Eamon Duval approached as Avery signed the deed, his boots clicking against the courthouse stones with the measured rhythm of a man who'd walked these same steps for 20 years. The lawman's hand lingered on a ring of tarnished keys as he watched Avery's signature take shape. "You sure about this, Mr. Quinn?" Duval's voice carried the weight of unspoken warnings. "The monarch's been shuttered for near on 8 years now. Some places are meant to stay that way." Avery pocketed the deed and studied the sheriff's weathered face. "I restore things for a living, Sheriff. Give me warped wood and cracked plaster, and I'll make them sing again." Duval's fingers tightened around the keys. Some songs shouldn't be sung twice. He turned away, but not before Avery caught sight of what looked like sub-basement keys among the collection. Odd for a 3-story hotel, the Monarch Hotel stood like a wounded giant at the corner of Meridian and 3rd, its red brick facade still elegant, despite the boarded windows and weather-stained awning. Avery crossed the threshold into a lobby that smelled of dust and secrets. A crystal chandelier hung askew from a medallion ceiling, its missing pieces scattered across warped hardwood floors like fallen stars. But it was the precision that struck him first. Despite the decay, every angle in the room felt deliberate. The reception desk aligned perfectly with the staircase. The corridor mouths opened at mathematically regular intervals. Even the scattered furniture seemed to follow some invisible grid pattern, as if the chaos itself had been choreographed. Avery pulled out his measuring tape and began documenting the room dimensions, 32 feet by 24 feet. Perfect proportions for... He traced the walls, noting how the heating vents were positioned at exact intervals, how the crown molding contained subtle breaks that might serve as reference points. Behind the reception desk, brass room numbers lay scattered across the scarred wood surface. Avery picked up the 12 and felt something give. The number unscrewed into 2 separate pieces, thin brass stencils that, when held to the light, revealed different hole patterns. One piece showed dots and dashes, the other geometric shape. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured, fitting the pieces back together. Someone was encoding messages right in plain sight. The player piano dominated the far corner like a silent sentinel. Its mahogany case gleamed despite the neglect, but when Avery lifted the fallboard, he found a mechanism unlike any he'd seen. Where hammers should have struck strings, thin brass strikers hung in perfect alignment above what looked like typewriter keys etched into a metal plate. He pressed middle C. Instead of music, a sharp clicking sound echoed through the heating vents, a rhythmic pattern that seemed to travel the walls themselves. The piano roll began to advance on its own, driven by air pressure from somewhere deep in the building's bones. Avery ran his fingers along the striker assembly and discovered letters scratched beneath the fallboard in a neat, precise hand. A, B, C, D, E. Each letter paired with a specific striker position. This wasn't a player piano at all. It was a massive, mechanical typewriter disguised as an instrument. By lantern light, Avery opened the piano's cabinet fully, revealing the intricate clockwork of its deception. Pneumatic tubes snaked through the interior, like metallic intestines, connecting to valves that controlled not musical hammers, but those brass strikers. A sheet of notations had been tucked behind the music rack, handwritten columns pairing letters with room coordinates. Room 20,000 B, room 203. C. Room 2205. The pattern continued through the entire alphabet, mapping letters to specific locations throughout the hotel. Avery cross-referenced this with his measurements of the building's layout. The rooms formed a perfect grid, 5 across, 4 high, with corridors positioned to allow the pneumatic system to reach every corner. He found a piece of blank music manuscript paper and began transcribing the clicking pattern he'd heard. Each click corresponded to a room position, each pause to a space or punctuation. Slowly, painstakingly, words emerged from the mechanical chatter. Guest 24 transfer con. The message cut off abruptly, but the implication chilled Avery's blood. This wasn't random mechanical noise. Someone had programmed this piano to type specific intelligence, letter by letter, using the hotel's room numbers as a cipher key. He traced the airflow from the piano's pneumatic system to a baseboard grill near the lobby's north wall. When he pried the metal grate free, a distinctly waxy scent drifted up from the darkness below, carried on a faint draft that suggested the building's respiratory system was very much alive. The air currents followed patterns too organized for accident. Avery sketched the visible ductwork, noting how every tube seemed designed to capture and channel sound from specific directions. The heating system hadn't been built for warmth, it had been engineered for listening. As he worked by lamplight, copying down the cipher combinations and mapping airflow patterns, a soft scuffling sound made him freeze. From the shadows near the lobby's far corner, a smoke-gray cat emerged, moving with the confidence of long familiarity. The animal's green eyes fixed on Avery for a moment before it padded directly to a loose brass stopper that had fallen from the piano mechanism. The cat batted the stopper playfully, chasing it across the floor until it rolled into a gap between the baseboard and the hardwood planks. Instead of disappearing, the stopper clinked against something metallic below, and a section of the floor shifted slightly, revealing the outline of a hidden access panel. Avery knelt beside the cat, which sat back on its haunches with an expression of feline satisfaction. "Well, friend," he murmured, scratching behind the animal's ears. "Looks like you know this place better than I do." The access panel lifted easily once Avery found its concealed hinges. Below lay a narrow shaft, lined with more pneumatic tubing, descending into darkness that his lantern couldn't fully penetrate. The waxy scent grew stronger, along with something else, the unmistakable odor of old recordings, of wax cylinders stored in close quarters. The cat, Avery had begun thinking of it as ledger, given its apparent role in cataloging the hotel's secrets, led him through a maintenance passage behind the laundry chute. The space was barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, but Ledger navigated it with the ease of long practice, pausing occasionally to ensure Avery could follow. The passage opened into a circular chamber that took Avery's breath away. Wax cylinders lined the curved walls from floor to ceiling, thousands of them arranged in precise rows on custom shelving. Pneumatic tubes converged on the room like the pipes of a massive organ, each terminating in a recording apparatus designed to capture and preserve whatever sounds traveled through the hotel's hidden circulatory system. This was no mere storage room. It was an archive, the listening gallery. Each cylinder bore labels in the same precise handwriting he'd found in the piano. Room numbers, dates, and sets of initials that might represent guests, staff. Some cylinders were stamped with additional markings, a monogram reading CC enclosed in an ornate cartouche, along with what appeared to be catalogue numbers. Avery selected a cylinder marked Room 308 May 15th, SK Transfer Authorization, and examined it by lantern light. The wax showed the spiral grooves of a proper recording, but also bore tiny perforations that might correspond to the piano's cipher system. Someone had been encoding messages directly onto these cylinders, using the room layout as a key. Ledger had found another loose brass stopper, this one wedged behind a fallen cylinder rack. The cat's batting dislodged a nearly invisible junction plate, revealing another pneumatic line that pulsed with faint air pressure. The system wasn't entirely dormant. A brass canister had been tucked into this hidden junction, bearing the same CC monogram. Avery unscrewed its cap and found it contained rolled papers covered in architectural drawings and cipher tables. The heading on the topmost sheet read, "Curators of Confidence, Operational Manual." His hands trembled as he unrolled the document. Detailed floor plans showed the hotel's true purpose, every room wired for sound, every conversation captured and catalogued, every secret preserved on wax for future leverage. The Monarch had never been a hotel at all. It had been a listening post, a blackmail engine, disguised as hospitality. The manual's final page contained a roster of names with notations beside each: Land Commissioner, Compliant, District Attorney, Leveraged, Railroad Supervisor, Eliminated. The dates stretched back decades, suggesting the curators of confidence had been harvesting secrets long before the Monarch's official closure. A soft hiss echoed through the chamber as pressurized air cycled through the pneumatic line. Somewhere in the building's depths, machinery still turned, still listened, still waited to preserve whatever conversations might drift through its mechanical ears. Avery pocketed one of the coded cylinders and the brass canister, his mind racing through the implications. This wasn't just historical curiosity, it was evidence of a systematic operation that had likely destroyed lives, swayed elections, and corrupted justice on a scale he was only beginning to comprehend. The sound of footsteps on the lobby floor above made him freeze. Someone had entered the hotel, moving with the purposeful stride of familiarity rather than the cautious steps of a stranger. Ledger's ears flattened, and the cat slipped silently toward another hidden passage that Avery hadn't noticed. A woman's voice drifted down through the ventilation system, cool, cultured, and carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mr. Quinn?" The voice seemed to come from multiple directions at once, amplified and distorted by the very system that had once captured so many unwary conversations. "I believe we need to discuss what you found in my family's hotel." Avery extinguished his lantern and followed Ledger into the shadows, clutching the cylinder and canister against his chest. Above them, polished heels clicked against hardwood with the patience of a predator who knew her prey had nowhere to run. The Monarch Hotel had kept its secrets for 8 years. Now those secrets were stirring, and Avery Quinn found himself holding the key to a conspiracy that someone was very much interested in keeping buried, along with anyone foolish enough to dig it up. The woman who stood in the Monarch's lobby commanded attention without raising her voice. Lenora Pike wore traveling clothes that whispered of distant cities and serious money, a charcoal wool dress cut with precision, gloves of buttery leather, and boots that had never known an honest day's mud. Her pale eyes surveyed the decaying grandeur with the calculating gaze of someone appraising livestock. "Mr. Quinn," she said, removing those expensive gloves with deliberate slowness, "I do hope you'll forgive the intrusion. When I heard someone had finally purchased the Monarch, I simply had to introduce myself." Avery emerged from the shadows near the service corridor, fighting to keep his expression neutral. The cylinder and canister felt like lead weights in his coat pockets. "Mrs. Pike, Lenora Pike." She extended a hand that felt surprisingly strong. "My family has deep roots in this territory. We've been keeping an eye on this property for some time." Before Avery could respond, the front door swung open again, admitting a woman whose energy filled the room like electricity before a storm. Nina Valdez moved with the purposeful stride of someone perpetually late for an important appointment, her reporter's satchel slung across her shoulder and ink stains decorating her fingers like badges of honor. "Sorry to interrupt," Nina said, though her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "I'm looking for Avery Quinn, the museum restorer, who made quite a splash refusing to authenticate that Remington forgery last year." Avery felt heat rise in his cheeks. "That would be me, though I'm not sure why it's relevant." Nina's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Because men who choose conscience over comfortable lies tend to see things others miss. And this building," she gestured at the lobby's precise geometry, "has been missing things for a very long time." Lenora's expression never changed, but something cold flickered behind her pale eyes. "Miss Valdez, isn't it?" I recall reading your colorful expose on municipal corruption. Such a shame when promising journalism careers encounter editorial discretion. Funny thing about buried stories, Nina replied, pulling a worn notebook from her satchel. They have a way of clawing back to the surface. She turned to Avery. I've been researching the Monarch for months. Something about its closure never sat right, too neat, too sudden, too many people happy to forget it existed. Avery caught Nina's eye and nodded almost imperceptibly toward the player piano. Her gaze followed his, and he watched understanding dawn across her sharp features as she noticed the mechanical precision of the exposed striker assembly. Fascinating instrument, Nina murmured, approaching the piano with the reverence of an archaeologist examining a fresh dig. Though I suspect it played more than melodies. Lenora stepped between them and the piano, her movement casual but definitive. The Monarch holds many childhood memories for my family, which is why I'm prepared to make Mr. Quinn an exceedingly generous offer. She produced a leather portfolio from her traveling bag. $50,000, cash settlement. The property deed transferred to a preservation trust that will ensure its proper restoration. The sum hung in the air like incense. Avery had paid $4 12 hours ago. 50,000 would let him disappear, find some quiet coastal town, restore church windows and school desks for the rest of his days. That's remarkably generous, he said carefully. For a property that allegedly has no value, sentimental value can be priceless. Lenora's smile was winter silk. The Monarch once served as a hub for this community's social fabric. Important conversations took place within these walls, decisions that shaped the territory's development. Her eyes found his and held them. Some might say it helped keep the peace. Nina snorted. Peace, bought with blackmail, usually doesn't last. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Lenora turned to Nina with the slow, predatory grace of a cat, focusing on a mouse. Careful, Miss Valdez. Accusations require evidence, and evidence has a way of disappearing when it threatens community stability. Heavy footsteps on the front porch announced Sheriff Duval's arrival. The lawman filled the doorway, his weathered face revealing nothing as he took in the tableau. Avery clutching his coat, Nina poised like a coiled spring, Lenora radiating genteel menace. Ladies, Mr. Quinn. Duval's voice carried the weary neutrality of a man who'd learned to navigate dangerous currents by staying in the shallows. Heard voices, wanted to make sure everything was peaceful. Perfectly peaceful, Sheriff, Lenora said. I was just explaining to Miss Quinn how much the community values stability, how we all benefit when certain historical curiosities remain undisturbed. Duval's hand moved unconsciously to the keyring at his belt. Sometimes the past is better left buried, he said, but his eyes found Avery's with something that might have been warning or apology. And sometimes, Nina said, the past refuses to stay dead. She pulled a folded newspaper clipping from her note. Funny how many accidents befell prominent citizens right after the Monarch's sudden closure. Almost like someone was tying up loose ends. Lenora gathered her gloves with practiced calm. I'll leave my offer on the table, Mr. Quinn, but generosity has its limits. And patience. Her smile was arctic, even more so. She glided toward the door with the fluid motion of deep water, pausing only to address Sheriff Duval. Do give my regards to your deputy, Sheriff. I understand he's been asking questions about old evidence files. Curiosity can be such a dangerous trait in a lawman. After she left, the silence stretched taut as piano wire. Duval studied his boots, Nina scribbled furiously in her notebook, and Avery felt the weight of the cylinder in his pocket like a loaded gun. She's right about one thing, Duval finally said. This place has a way of destroying people who get too curious. He looked directly at Avery. But sometimes a man reaches a point where he's got to choose between safety and what's right. He turned to leave, then paused. If you need those sub-basement keys, Quinn, you know where to find me. That night, Avery and Nina descended to the listening gallery by the light of 2 oil lamps, ledger padding silently ahead of them through passages that seemed designed for secrets rather than service. The circular chamber felt different in the deeper darkness, more cathedral than archive, its thousands of cylinders gleaming like votive candles in the flickering light. Nina whistled low as she took in the scope of the collection. "How many conversations do you think are stored here?" "Decades worth," Avery replied, carefully selecting the cylinder he'd pocketed earlier. "Maybe centuries if they started before the official hotel operation." They'd brought a hand-cranked phonograph head that Nina had borrowed from the newspaper office, a relic from back when reporters still recorded interviews on wax. Avery rigged it to play the cylinder marked Room 3. "Transfer authorization," his hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to hear. The first sounds were mechanical, the hiss of the recording apparatus engaging, the faint whisper of air through pneumatic tubes. Then a voice emerged from the horn like silk poured over broken glass. A woman singing, her melody weaving through words that gradually resolved into conversation. "Told you the land commissioner was weakening," the woman was saying. Her voice carried the smoky authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "The railroad survey has him spooked, says he never agreed to falsify the mineral reports." A male voice, older and harder. "Sable, darling, you worry too much. Commissioner Walsh will see reason once he understands the alternatives." Sable, Avery and Nina exchanged glances. The voice belonged to Sable Knox, the lounge singer who'd once headlined at the Monarch's piano bar. The conversation continued, revealing a web of corruption that stretched from land deals to judicial appointments. Names dropped like stones into still water. Judge Carruthers, who'd ruled on railroad right-of-way cases. Deputy Marshal Hendricks, who'd investigated claim disputes. Railroad Supervisor Chen, who'd certified survey reports. Each name came with details, payments made, favors granted, evidence suppressed. The recording time-stamped every revelation with the rhythmic clicking of the player piano, encoding the conversation in the same cipher system Avery had discovered. "Jesus," Nina breathed, scribbling frantically. "This isn't just blackmail, it's a systematic corruption of every level of territorial government." The recording shifted to more immediate threats. The older voice, which Nina identified as belonging to Judge Carruthers, spoke of a jury foreman who'd grown unreliable in a land fraud case. There was discussion of leverage, of consequences, of the need to maintain order through whatever means necessary. Then Sable's voice, again, now strained with something that might have been fear. "And if he won't be bought, then he'll be buried," came the cold reply, "along with anyone else who threatens the stability we've worked so hard to build." The cylinder ended with a mechanical click that echoed through the listening gallery like a judge's gavel. Avery and Nina sat in stunned silence, the weight of what they'd heard settling over them like grave dirt. "Jury foreman," Nina said finally. "I remember the case. Samuel Bright, found dead 3 days after the verdict, thrown from his horse," they said. "Tragic accident." Avery was examining the piano mechanism that had encoded the conversation. Hidden inside the action, tucked behind the pneumatic valves, he found a folded sheet of architectural drawings. The paper was yellowed with age, covered in precise engineering sketches, and bearing the initials CY. "Cyrus Yarrow," he murmured, studying the schematic. "This shows the entire pneumatic system, not just for recording, but for broadcasting." His finger traced the complex valve arrangements. "There's a fail-safe here, reverse the air pressure, and instead of capturing conversations, the system becomes a transmission network. Every room, every vent, every pneumatic line becomes a speaker." Nina leaned over his shoulder, her breath warm against his cheek. "You're saying we could broadcast these recordings back through the hotel?" "More than that." Avery pointed to additional lines on the schematic that extended beyond the hotel's footprint. "This network connects to other buildings. The courthouse, the railroad office, the telegraph station. Reverse the system, and we could transmit these confessions to half the town. The implications hung between them like a loaded weapon. They possessed not just evidence of past crimes, but the means to expose them on a scale that would be impossible to suppress or deny. The soft scraping sound from above made them both freeze. Footsteps on the lobby floor, multiple sets, moving with the coordinated precision of men who knew their business. "Time to go," Nina whispered, natting her notes in the crucial cylinder. But as they extinguished their lamps and prepared to flee deeper into the hotel's hidden passages, both realized they'd crossed a line from which there would be no retreat. The monarch's secrets were no longer buried. Now the question was whether Avery and Nina would live long enough to reveal them. Dawn found them at the modest boarding house where Silas Whitcomb had lived since the monarch's closure. The former hotel manager occupied a single room lined floor to ceiling with ledgers, account books, and meticulously organized files, the paper soul of a building that had died around him. Silas himself was a study in faded precision, sharp creases in worn clothing, shoes polished to military standard, and the kind of posture that suggested decades of standing at attention behind a reception desk. His pale eyes flickered with nervous energy as he admitted them to his carefully ordered sanctuary. "I wondered when someone would come asking about the old days," he said, gesturing to chairs that had clearly been arranged for visitors he'd never expected to receive. 8 years of silence, and now suddenly everyone's interested in the monarch's history. Nina pulled out her notebook, but Silas raised a trembling hand. "Before you start with questions, Miss Valdez, let me show you something that might save us all considerable time." From a vest pocket, he produced a palm-sized index card, so worn the edges had gone soft as fabric. The surface was covered in microscopic handwriting, hundreds of entries pairing guest names with alphanumeric codes. "Master Index," Silas explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every guest who stayed at the Monarch from 1889 to 1897. Every conversation recorded, every cylinder catalogued." His fingers traced the faded entries. 23 territorial officials, 14 railroad executives, 8 federal marshals, 47 land commissioners and surveyors. Avery studied the card, recognizing the same precise handwriting from the piano notations and cylinder labels. "You kept this all these years?" "Kept it," Silas laughed, but the sound held no humor. "Son, I've been carrying this card around for 8 years, trying to decide whether to burn it or bury myself with it." He looked up at them with eyes that had seen too much. "Do you have any idea what it's like knowing that half the territorial government was compromised? That land deals worth millions were fixed. That good men died to keep these secrets buried." Nina leaned forward. "Then help us expose it. Help us make it right. Make it right." Silas shook his head. "Miss, there's no making this right. You publish this. Half the territory's legal framework collapses. Property deeds get challenged. Court decisions get overturned. Businesses built on crooked deals go under." He clutched the card tighter. "Sometimes the cure is worse than the disease." As if summoned by their conversation, Ledger appeared at the boarding house window, pressing against the glass with feline persistence. Silas opened the window, and the cat leaped gracefully onto his desk, immediately nosing around the neat stacks of papers. "Well, hello there, old friend," Silas murmured, scratching behind Ledger's ears. "Still making rounds, are you?" The cat knocked over a small wooden box, spilling its contents across the desk. Among the scattered items was another index card, identical to the master index but slightly newer, the handwriting fresher. "Backup copy," Silas admitted with a rueful smile. "Old habits. Always keep a duplicate, a vital record." He looked at Avery and Nina with something that might have been resignation. "I suppose if Ledger's brought you here, the choice has been made for me." Before anyone could respond, heavy boots on the boarding house stairs announced an unwelcome visitor. Sheriff Duval appeared in the doorway, his face grim as winter sky. "Morning, Silas. Folks." His gaze took in the scattered papers, the index cards, the guilt written across their faces. "Heard there might be some discussion of old business happening here." Silas went rigid. his hand moving protectively over the master index. "Sheriff, I had a visit from Lenora Pike this morning," Duval continued, stepping into the room. "She's concerned about outsiders stirring up trouble, asking questions about sealed evidence files, spreading rumors about past investigations." The silence stretched taut as a hangman's rope. Nina's hand moved toward her notebook. Avery shifted to shield the index cards, and Silas looked like a man preparing for execution. Then Duval did something unexpected. He closed the door behind him and turned the lock. "She also mentioned," he said quietly, "that certain historical documents might need to be preserved for posterity. Evidence that could shed light on old cases that were never properly resolved." His eyes found Silas. "Cases where good men died and the truth got buried along with them." Silas stared at the sheriff for a long moment, then slowly pushed the master index across the desk. "One day, I'll give you 1 day with this card, on your word of honor that you'll use it to serve justice, not vengeance." Duval picked up the card with hands that trembled slightly. "There's a difference between justice and revenge. Sometimes it takes a man 20 years to learn which one he's really after." He looked at Avery and Nina. "If you're planning what I think you're planning, you'll need more than evidence. You'll need someone who knows how to work the hotel's deeper systems." His head moved to the key ring at his belt. "And you'll need access to places that have been locked since the night everything went wrong." As if in response to his words, Ledger leaped from the desk to his shoulder, purring with the satisfaction of a creature that had just orchestrated exactly the meeting it intended. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, but inside Silas Whitcomb's carefully ordered room, the shadows of the past were finally beginning to retreat. The copper star sat at the edge of respectability like a woman who'd learned to make peace with her reputation. Smoke and whiskey scented the air, while oil lamps cast dancing shadows across walls lined with theatrical posters from better days. At the room's heart, a small stage held a scarred piano where Sable Knox commanded attention 3 nights a week. She was older now than the voice on the cylinder, her auburn hair showing silver threads and her green silk dress revealing the careful construction of maintained beauty. But when she sang, time collapsed. Her voice still carried that smoky authority that could make men confess sins they hadn't known they possessed. Avery and Nina waited through 2 songs before approaching her table during the break. Sable studied them with the calculating gaze of someone who'd learned to read danger in strangers' faces. "Let me guess," she said, stirring her whiskey with one finger. "You're the museum man who bought the Monarch, and you're the reporter who writes stories nobody wants published." Her smile held winter's edge. Word travels fast in a small territory. Nina placed the cylinder on the table between them like evidence in a trial. "We know you were recorded. We know they used your voice to blackmail territorial officials. We know you've been living with that knowledge for 8 years. Sable's composure never wavered, but something shifted behind her eyes, a door opening on old pain. "Knowledge is a dangerous luxury in my profession, Miss Valdez. Survival requires forgetting more than remembering." "They're trying to resurrect the system," Avery said quietly. "Lenora Pike and whoever's backing her. They want the hotel operational again, the listening network restored." He leaned forward, "But we found a way to turn it against them, to broadcast the truth instead of hiding it." Sable lifted the cylinder, holding it to the lamplight as if she could see through wax to the words imprisoned within. "You want me to help you expose conversations I never consented to having recorded." She set it down with infinite care. "Conversations that could destroy what little reputation I've managed to rebuild. Or," Nina said, "conversations that could free you from 8 years of looking over your shoulder." For a long moment, Sable said nothing. Then she reached into her handbag and withdrew a leather portfolio filled with sheet music. The pages were yellow with age, covered in her neat musical notations, tempo markings, key changes, rhythmic patterns that seemed to follow no conventional structure. "I kept my set lists from those years," she said, spreading the sheets across the table. "Didn't know why at first. Something about the way they made me perform. the specific songs in specific orders. Her finger traced a sequence of tempo markings. It wasn't until months later that I realized what they'd done. Avery studied the notations, recognizing patterns that echoed the piano's cipher system. They encoded messages in your performances, used your songs as a transmission method. Every night for 3 years, Sable confirmed, they'd give me a playlist, tell me the exact tempo for each song. Said it was for atmosphere, for creating the right mood for their guests. Her laugh was bitter as burnt coffee. I was their unwitting telegraph operator, broadcasting secrets in waltz time and foxtrot rhythms. Nina pulled out her notebook, cross-referencing the musical notions with the master index they'd copied from Silas. There's tempo signature here. It corresponds to the Judge Carruthers recording. And this one matches the land commissioner's conversation. More than that, Sable said, pulling out a magnifying glass and examining the sheet music more closely. I marked down the specific rhythmic patterns that felt wrong, that didn't match the songs as written. If I'm reading this correctly, they embedded letter substitutions in the musical phrasing. Each tempo change represents a different cipher key. She began marking the patterns with a pencil, revealing how musical notation had been weaponized into code. A quarter note at tempo 20 to 1 decreased to letter A in room 12. A half note at tempo 90 equals the letter B in room 12. They turned my entire repertoire into a transmission system. The implications staggered Ev. Not only had the curators of confidence recorded private conversations, they'd broadcast coded intelligence through public performances, using Sable's voice to distribute blackmail material and coordinate their operations. This is how they communicated with off-site Confederates, he realized. Your performances weren't just entertainment, they were intelligence briefings disguised as music. Sable's hands trembled slightly as she folded the sheet music. Every song I sang was someone's secret. Every note was someone's ruin. She looked up at them with eyes that had seen too much. Do you understand what you're asking me to do? To relive every moment of that exploitation, to make it public, to admit that I was their instrument. We're asking you to help us turn their weapon against them, Nina said. To use your voice for justice instead of blackmail. Before Sable could respond, the saloon's atmosphere shifted. Conversations grew quieter, and several patrons found pressing reasons to examine their drinks. A man had entered through the back door, tall, lean, with the measured gait of someone accustomed to violence, held in careful check. Jonah Pike moved through the room like smoke. His presence felt rather than announced. He approached their table with the inevitability of bad weather, his pale eyes taking in the cylinder, the sheet music, the guilty expressions they couldn't quite hide. Miss Knox, he said, touching the brim of his hat with mock courtesy. Miss Valdez, Mr. Quinn. His voice carried the flat authority of someone who'd never needed to raise it. I understand you've been having interesting conversations about old times. Sable's stage persona slipped into place like armor. Jonah Pike, still doing your cousin's dirty work, I see. Family business requires careful attention, he replied, settling into an empty chair without invitation. Especially when outsiders start asking questions about private matters. His gaze fixed on the cylinder. Some songs shouldn't be played twice. Nina's hand moved toward her satchel, but Jonah's attention shifted to her with the focused intensity of a predator. I wouldn't reach for that notebook, Miss Valdez. Publishing unsubstantiated stories can be hazardous to one's health. Threatening journalists is a federal crime, Nina said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. Jonah's smile was winter frost. I'm not threatening anyone, simply observing that accidents happen to people who don't mind their own business. He stood with fluid grace. Enjoy your evening, folks, and remember, some performances are better left in the past. As he glided toward the saloon's exit, Sable made her decision. The service corridor, she said quietly, behind the stage. Move slowly, like you're just going to powder your nose. They gathered the evidence with forced casualness, following Sable through a narrow passage that connected the copper star to the building next door. The corridor was dusty and cramped, clearly designed for staff rather than patrons, but it offered concealment from Jonah's watching eyes. "There's a dumbwaiter here," Sable explained, pressing against a panel that swung inward to reveal a service shaft. "Connects to the seamstress shop above." "We can." The panel burst open from below, and a young woman's grease-stained face appeared in the opening. Tess Calder, barely 18, with mechanic's coveralls and knowing eyes that belonged on someone twice her age. "Trouble coming through the front," she said without preamble. 3 more men just tied their horses outside. "They're not here for the music." She looked at Avery with sharp recognition. "You're the fool who bought the Monarch. Hope you know what you've gotten yourself into." "More every minute," Avery admitted, helping Nina and Sable into the dumbwaiter shaft. Tess operated the pulley system with practiced efficiency, hauling them to the upper floor while voices echoed from the saloon below. Jonah's men searching for their quarry. "I know every service passage in this district," Tess said as they crowded into the seamstress shop's storage room. "Grew up in them back when the Monarch was still pretending to be a hotel." Her eyes found Sable's. "I remember you singing. Used to sneak down to listen through the heating vent." Sable studied the young woman's face, recognition dawning. The orphan girl who slept in the laundry room. "You must be Tess. Must be." Tess grinned, but her expression grew serious as she addressed the group. "If you're planning to expose the old listening system, you'll need to access the sub-basement, and if you want to do it without ending up like Samuel Bright and the others, you'll need someone who knows the service route." Through the shop window they could see Jonah's men emerging from the Copper Star, their search having come up empty. But their formation suggested this was only the beginning of a much more thorough hunt. "They'll watch the hotel now," Nina said. "Guard every entrance." Tess's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Good thing they don't know about the maintenance tunnels. The Monarch's connected to half the buildings on this block through the old steam system. I can get you inside without them ever seeing you coming." Sable was already rolling up her sheet music. "Decision made. If we're doing this, we need to move tonight. Once Lenora realizes I'm actively helping you, she'll stop being polite about getting what she wants." As they prepared to leave through Tess's hidden routes, Avery caught sight of movement in the street below. Lenora Pike stood beside a black carriage, her elegant silhouette unmistakable even in the gaslight's uncertain glow. She wasn't hurrying, wasn't directing her men with urgency or panic. She was waiting, like a spider who knew exactly which strand of her web had been disturbed. Sheriff Duval's office occupied the courthouse basement, a cramped space that smelled of old coffee and older regrets. Gun racks lined the walls between filing cabinets that held 2 decades of careful documentation, reports filed, evidence catalogued, justice served, and occasionally subverted. At this hour, with midnight approaching, the building's upper floors lay silent as graves. Avery spread the evidence across Duval's scarred desk. Cylinders, sheet music, the master index, and Cyrus Yarrow's architectural drawings. Each piece told part of a story that had shaped the territory's development through blackmail, corruption, and selective violence. 20 years I've been wearing this badge," Duval said, picking up one of the cylinders with hands that trembled slightly. 20 years of knowing something was rotten in the foundations, and doing nothing because I couldn't prove it." He looked up at Avery with eyes that held decades of compromise. Samuel Bright wasn't thrown from his horse. Nina looked up from her notes. "You knew. Suspected. Hell, more than suspected." "I knew." Duval's voice carried the weight of buried guilt. "Bright came to me 3 days before he died. Said someone had approached him about changing his vote in the Hendricks land fraud case. Offered him money first, then showed him photographs that could ruin his daughter's reputation. The sheriff's jaw tightened. When he refused both bribes and threats, they played him a recording of his own voice discussing private family matters. Conversations he'd had in his hotel room during the trial." Sable nodded grimly. "Room 33, I remember the playlist from that week. Heavy on minor keys and slow tempos. They were encoding threats." "Bright was terrified," Duval continued, But he was also angry, said he'd rather die than let corruption buy his conscience. The sheriff opened his desk drawer and pulled out a key ring, his fingers lingering on a pair of tarnished brass keys. 2 days later, his horse came home riderless, found his body at the bottom of Miller's Gorge with a broken neck. "And you did nothing," Nina said, though her tone held understanding rather than accusation. "What could I do? No witnesses, no evidence, no proof the horse hadn't simply spooked." Duval's laugh was bitter. "3 days after the funeral, I found this in my evidence locker." He pulled out a small wax cylinder marked with Bright's initials. Recording of him discussing his decision to change his vote, except he'd never made that decision. They'd edited his voice, cut and spliced his words to create a false confession. The cylinder sat on the desk like an accusation. Duval stared at it for a long moment before continuing. "That's when I understood the scope of what we were dealing with. They could manufacture evidence as easily as they could gather it. Any investigation I started could be turned against me. Any witness I found could be discredited with fabricated recordings of their own voices." Tess, who'd been silent in the corner, spoke up. "So you chose survival over justice?" Duval met her gaze without flinching. "I chose to wait for a moment when justice might actually be possible." He looked at the evidence spread across his desk. "Maybe that moment is now." The office door opened to admit Marielle Hart, her medical bag clutched in one hand and a thick ledger in the other. She'd come directly from a difficult birth, her dress still bearing traces of her profession, but her eyes held the sharp focus of someone who'd made a decision that couldn't be unmade. "I brought the records you asked for, Sheriff," she said, setting the ledger beside the other evidence. 23 deaths over 8 years that I treated or examined. Accidents, suicides, sudden illnesses, all involving people who'd stayed at the Monarch or had dealings with territorial officials. She opened the ledger to pages marked with colored tabs. "Cross-reference these dates. With your cylinder, timestamps and patterns emerge." Nina began comparing the medical records to the master index, her reporter's instincts organizing the data into narrative threads. Land Commissioner Walsh, apparent heart attack 3 days after the Hendricks case verdict. Railroad Supervisor Chen, thrown from his horse 2 weeks after filing his mineral survey. Judge Carruthers, suicide by laudanum, but his autopsy shows signs of force feeding. 16 of these deaths, Hart said quietly, occurred within 48 hours of my patients expressing doubts about official decisions they'd made or evidence they'd presented. The timing suggests someone was monitoring their psychological state and acting when they showed signs of becoming unreliable. Duval picked up the sub-basement keys, weighing them in his palm like scales of justice. They had a system, record conversations to gather intelligence, use that intelligence to leverage decisions, then eliminate anyone who threatened to expose the arrangement. He looked around the room at the assembled faces. And it worked for decades because no one could prove the connections. "Until now," Avery said, pointing to Cyrus Yarrow's schematic. "This failsafe doesn't just reverse the recording system, it amplifies it. Every pneumatic line becomes a speaker, every vent becomes a transmission point. We could broadcast these recordings to every connected building in the district." Sable studied the architectural drawings, her musical training helping her interpret the complex acoustic engineering. The courthouse, the telegraph office, the railroad depot, they're all connected to the pneumatic network. If we timed this right, we could transmit during business hours when all those buildings are occupied. Transmission is one thing, Nina said, looking up from the medical ledger. But we need corroboration. Physical evidence that can't be dismissed as fabrication. She gestured to Dr. Hart's records. Medical testimony linking the deaths to the recordings. Official statements from law enforcement confirming the pattern. All eyes turned to Sheriff Duval. The weight of 20 years pressed down on his shoulders like physical force. But something had shifted in his expression. Resignation, giving way to resolve. "I've been carrying these keys for 8 years, he said, closing his fist around the brass, telling myself I was protecting evidence, keeping it safe until the right moment. He looked up at them with eyes that had found their purpose again. But I was really protecting myself, protecting my position, my reputation, my comfortable cowardice. He stood with the decisive motion of a man who'd finally chosen his side. If we're doing this, we do it right. Official documentation, chain of evidence, everything by the book so it can't be dismissed or suppressed. He turned to Nina. How long do you need to print your story? Give me 6 hours and I can have copies distributed to every newspaper between here and the territorial capital, Nina replied. But we'll need the broadcast to provide cover, create enough public outcry that suppressing the story becomes impossible. Hart closed her ledger with the finality of a coffin lid. I'll provide sworn testimony about the suspicious deaths, medical evidence that courts can't ignore. Sable gathered her sheet music, the papers rustling like autumn leaves, and I'll decode the transmission protocols. Make sure every word is heard, exactly as it was recorded. Tess cracked her knuckles with anticipation. I'll get you into the sub-basement and make sure the pneumatic system is ready for broadcast. The machine that stole voices is about to give them back. Duval pocketed the keys and reached for his hat. Then we end this tonight. One way or another, the truth comes out at dawn. As they prepared to leave, none of them noticed the shadow that moved past the basement window or heard the soft click of a telegraph key from the office next door. Lenora Pike's network extended further than any of them realized, and she'd been listening to their plans with the same patient attention her ancestors had once devoted to gathering secrets. The hunt was about to become a siege, and the Monarch Hotel would serve as battleground for a war between those who hoarded truth and those willing to die setting it free. Dawn was still an hour away when Lenora Pike's forces moved to seal the district. Her strategy unfolded with the precision of a military operation. Telegraph lines cut to prevent outside communication, roads blocked by construction barriers, and armed men positioned at every intersection with the authority of badges bought and paid for years earlier. The Monarch Hotel stood at the center of this carefully constructed trap, its 3 stories looming against the pre-dawn sky like a fortress preparing for siege. But the real battle would be fought in the building's hidden arteries. The pneumatic system that had once harvested secrets and would now either broadcast truth or become a tomb for those who'd discovered it. Avery crouched in the sub-basement beside the main valve manifold. Cyrus Yarrow's schematic spread across his knees while Tess worked to reverse the air pressure system. The mechanical heart of the listening network filled the chamber with its brass tubes and copper fittings, all precisely engineered to carry whispered conversations from guest rooms to the recording apparatus above. There, Tess said, tightening the final valve connection. Airflow's reversed. Instead of drawing sound in, we're now pushing it out through every vent, every tube, every connected line in the district. She wiped grease from her hands with grim satisfaction. Question is, will the old system hold pressure long enough to complete the broadcast? Sheriff Duval stood guard at the sub-basement entrance, his service revolver checked and ready. Through the narrow windows, they could see movement in the street. Jonah Pike's men taking positions with the casual efficiency of professionals. How long do you need? Nina looked up from the cylinder she was preparing for broadcast. 15 minutes to transmit the key recordings. Another 10 to ensure they've reached all the connected buildings. She gestured to her hastily printed broadsheets stacked near the pneumatic hall. I've got copies ready for distribution once the audio evidence creates enough public outcry. Sable sat at a small table, her sheet music arranged before her like battle plans. I'll provide the decoding key as each cylinder plays, translate the musical cipher so listeners understand what they're hearing. Her voice carried the steady resolve of someone who'd finally found a way to fight back against years of exploitation. Above them the building creaked and settled as Lenora's forces moved into position. The sound of boots on hardwood filtered down through the pneumatic tubes, men searching room by room looking for the evidence, and the people who'd discovered it. They're cutting the gas lines, Duval reported, studying the street through a periscope mirror, trying to force evacuation through asphyxiation threat. Smart makes it look like an accident if anyone dies. Tess checked her bypass valve connections, ensuring the air supply would hold. I rerouted the intake to the old coal furnace system. We've got maybe 20 minutes of clean air before they locate and seal those ducts too. The first cylinder began to play, Sable's younger voice pouring through the pneumatic horn with startling clarity. But now her words carried context, Nina's printed explanation, and Sable's live translation, revealing the corruption hidden in musical cipher. The recording of Judge Carruthers discussing jury tampering echoed through every connected building in the district, impossible to ignore or suppress. How do we know it's working? Avery asked, adjusting the transmission pressure to ensure optimal clarity. His answer came from the street. Shouts erupted from the courthouse as staff arrived for work and heard the broadcast. Windows opened in office buildings as territorial officials recognized their own voices discussing bribes and cover-ups. The telegraph office, despite cut lines, buzzed with clerks who'd heard enough to understand the scope of the revelations. But Lenora Pike wasn't finished. Through the sub-basement windows, they watched her emerge from a black carriage with the controlled fury of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. She gestured sharply, and Jonah's men began a coordinated assault on the hotel's entrance. They're coming through the front lobby, Duval reported. Back service entrance too. We've got maybe 5 minutes before they reach the sub-basement. Nina gathered her broad brows, preparing for a desperate run to the street. I need to get these copies distributed while people are still listening to the broadcast. Physical evidence they can't suppress. I'll cover you, Duval said, checking his weapon. Tess, can you get Miss Valdez to the courthouse through the maintenance tunnels? Already mapped the route, Tess replied, indicating a narrow passage that connected to the old steam system. But someone needs to stay with the broadcast equipment. Those cylinders won't play themselves. Sable stood, her sheet music clutched against her chest. I'll stay. This is my voice, my story. If someone's going to see it through to the end, it should be me. Avery faced the hardest choice of his life. Run with Nina and Tess, try to preserve the evidence they'd gathered, and hope it would be enough to bring justice. Or stay with Sable and ensure the broadcast continued, knowing that Lenora's forces would show no mercy to those they found. The sound of splintering wood echoed from above as Jonah's men breached the hotel's main defenses. The pneumatic system hissed and wheezed, carrying their footsteps and shouted orders through the building's mechanical arteries. But it also carried something else, the continuing broadcast of recorded conversations that had shaped territorial politics through decades of blackmail and murder. Go, Sable said, squeezing Avery's hand. Make sure the world knows what we found here. Make sure those voices aren't silenced again. But as Nina, Tess and Duval prepared to leave through the maintenance tunnels, an unexpected ally appeared. Ledger the cat darted through a vent opening they hadn't noticed, followed immediately by the sound of pursuing boots going in the wrong direction. The animal's instinctive knowledge of the hotel's hidden passages had confused Jonah's men, buying them precious additional minutes. That cat just saved our lives, Tess breathed, watching Ledger settle calmly beside the broadcast equipment, as if guarding it. The final cylinder was loading into the transmission apparatus, the recording that would reveal the full scope of the Curators of Confidence conspiracy. As Sable's voice began to fill the pneumatic network, one last time, carrying with it the evidence that would finally bring justice to those who died for threatening the truth. The siege of the Monarch Hotel entered its final desperate phase. Through the floors above they could hear Lenora Pike's voice, cold and commanding, directing her men toward the sub-basement with the patience of a predator who knew her prey had nowhere left to run. The first rays of dawn crept through the courthouse windows as the last cylinder finished playing, its final words echoing through the pneumatic network with the finality of a judge's gavel. In the sub-basement of the Monarch Hotel, Sable Knox sat beside the silent broadcast equipment, her hands steady despite the chaos erupting above. Ledger the cat remained at her feet, green eyes fixed on the ceiling as boots thundered through the corridors overhead. The sound that saved them came not from inside the hotel, but from the street. A deep, rumbling roar of voices, hundreds of them, growing louder with each passing moment. The broadcast had worked with the entire district, had heard 23 cylinders worth of evidence, from Judge Carruthers' jury tampering to Railroad Supervisor Chen's falsified mineral reports. The truth that had been buried for decades was finally breathing in the morning light. Heavy footsteps on the sub-basement stairs announced Jonah Pike's arrival, but he descended alone, his usual complement of enforcers notably absent. When he reached the bottom step, his pale eyes took in the scene with something that might have been resignation rather than rage. "It's over," he said simply, his voice lacking its usual menacing authority. Every deputy in 3 counties heard those recordings. Every clerk, every official, every citizen walking to work. He looked at Sable with something approaching respect. "Your voice carried farther than my cousin ever imagined possible." Sable stood, brushing dust from her dress, with the calm dignity of someone who'd finally reclaimed her story. "Where is Lenora?" "Gone, vanished sometime during the broadcast, along with her carriage and most of her hired guns." Jonah's smile was bitter as winter frost. "Turns out loyalty has its limits when federal marshals start asking questions." Sheriff Duval appeared at the top of the stairs, no longer alone. Behind him came a contingent of deputies Avery didn't recognize, men wearing territorial badges rather than local ones, their presence suggesting authority that extended beyond Lenora Pike's sphere of influence. "Jonah Pike," Duval said, his voice carrying 20 years of suppressed justice. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, intimidation of witnesses, and accessory to murder in the deaths of Samuel Bright, Commissioner Walsh, and 16 other territorial citizens." Jonah offered his wrists without resistance, his composure never wavering. "I'll want to speak with a federal prosecutor about immunity in exchange for testimony. There are networks beyond this territory, operations that make the monarch look like amateur theater." As the deputies led Jonah away, Dr. Myrelle Hart descended into the sub-basement, her medical bag exchanged for a leather satchel containing official documents. "I've been appointed as federal medical examiner for the investigation," she announced. "Every suspicious death referenced in those recordings will be officially reviewed. Bodies will be exhumed, evidence re-examined, justice served even if it comes 20 years late." Nina Valdez burst through the maintenance tunnel entrance, her face flushed with excitement and ink stains decorating her fingers like victory medals. "The story's out," she announced breathlessly. "Every newspaper from here to the territorial capital is running the expos. I've got confirmation that copies reached the federal prosecutor's office, 3 territorial representatives, and a senator who's been investigating railroad corruption." Avery emerged from behind the pneumatic manifold, Cyrus Yarrow's schematic still clutched in his hands. "What about the physical evidence, the cylinders, the master index?" "All secured under federal custody," Duval replied. "Judge Morrison, who wasn't compromised apparently, issued warrants for the seizure of all materials related to the curators of confidence. The hotel, its contents, and every connected building will be searched and catalogued." Tess appeared from a ventilation shaft, grease-stained but grinning. "I've disconnected the listening network, cut every line, sealed every vent, disabled every recording device we could find." She paused, her expression growing thoughtful. "Though there's something else you need to see." She led them through a passage Avery hadn't known existed, past chambers filled with clockwork mechanisms and pneumatic regulators, to a room that felt different from the rest. "Cleaner, more recently used. Found this while I was severing the network," Tess explained, indicating a wall covered with maps and telegraph routing diagrams. The Monarch wasn't the only listening post. "Look, the maps showed connections extending far beyond the hotel, linking to railroad depots, territorial offices, and federal buildings across 3 states. Red lines indicated active networks, blue lines showed planned expansions, and green dots marked what appeared to be off-site recording facilities." Avery studied the diagrams with growing dread. This is what Jonah meant about networks beyond this territory. The curators of confidence weren't just a local operation. They were part of something much larger. Nina was already copying the maps into her notebook, her reporter's instincts recognizing a story that extended far beyond one corrupt hotel. If these diagrams are accurate, they've been systematically infiltrating federal communications for decades. This goes all the way to Washington. Sable picked up a cylinder from a shelf near the maps, one that bore markings different from the others they'd found. Instead of room numbers and guest initials, this one was labeled with what appeared to be federal department codes and Washington addresses. "We stopped one head of the Hydra," she said quietly, "but there are others." Hart was examining a collection of medical files stored in the room, records that appeared to document treatments for individuals who'd become problematic to the network's operations. "Systematic poisoning disguised as medical care," she murmured. They had physicians on their payroll, coroners who could falsify death certificates, sanitariums where inconvenient witnesses could disappear. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, but it was also vulnerable now. The broadcast had shattered decades of carefully maintained secrecy, and the evidence they'd uncovered would fuel investigations that could span years. "What happens to the hotel?" Avery asked, looking around at the mechanical marvel that had served as both his salvation and his doom. Sheriff Duvall consulted his official papers. Federal custody pending investigation. But once the legal proceedings are complete, he looked at Avery with something that might have been hope. "The deed's still in your net. You bought it fair and square, even if you didn't know what you were buying." 3 months later, the Monarch Hotel reopened its doors under very different circumstances. The lobby's crystal chandelier had been repaired and polished, the warped hardwood floors restored to their original luster. But the most significant change was the brass plaque mounted beside the player piano. This machine used to steal voices. Now it helps return them. The listening gallery had been converted into a public archive, its thousands of cylinders catalogued and made available to researchers, journalists and family members seeking closure for suspicious deaths. Silas Whitcomb served as chief archivist, his obsessive record-keeping finally serving justice rather than concealment. Sable Knox performed 3 nights a week in the restored lobby, but now her audiences came to hear testimony rather than entertainment. Truth nights, they called them, evenings, when survivors of the curator's operations could tell their stories to listeners who finally believed them. Nina Valdez had parlayed her exposé into a position with a territorial newspaper, her byline now carrying the authority of someone who'd proven that buried stories could indeed claw their way back to the surface. Her investigation into the broader conspiracy continued, following threads that stretched from territorial capitals to Washington drawing rooms. Sheriff Duvall wore his badge with renewed purpose, his office now serving as a coordination center for ongoing investigation. The sub-basement keys hung in a place of honor on his wall, a reminder that locked doors sometimes protected evidence rather than hiding it. Doc Hart's medical testimony had resulted in the exhumation and re-examination of 37 bodies, with evidence of systematic poisoning found in 23 cases. Her detailed records of suspicious deaths had become the foundation for a new federal protocol for investigating accidental fatalities involving political figures. Tess Calder had been hired as the hotel's chief engineer, responsible for maintaining the pneumatic system that now served as a tour route for visitors wanting to understand how systematic surveillance had operated in plain sight. Her intimate knowledge of the building's hidden passages made her the perfect guide for those seeking to comprehend the scope of institutional corruption. Avery Quinn had found his calling as more than just a restorer. The hotel had become a center for investigating similar operations across the territory, with researchers and federal agents using his discoveries to identify other hotels and boarding houses that might have served as listening posts. His $4 investment had purchased not just a building, but a chance to rebuild justice itself. Ledger the cat had claimed a sunny windowsill in the archive room, where visitors could often find the smoke-gray feline sleeping atop a box of cylinders, paws draped protectively over evidence that had almost been lost forever. The cat had become something of a mascot for the investigation, proof that even the smallest witnesses could preserve the most important truths. But not all the stories ended in resolution. Lenora Pike remained at large, her network's reach suggesting resources and connections that extended far beyond what they'd uncovered. Federal investigations continued, following paper trails and pneumatic lines that seemed to connect half the territorial government to systematic corruption. On quiet evenings, when the last visitors had left and the archive was locked for the night, Avery would sometimes walk through the restored hotel and listen to the building's natural sounds. Wood settling, wind through properly sealed windows, the distant murmur of honest conversation from the lobby below. The monarch no longer whispered with stolen secrets or clicked with encoded threats. It breathed with the freedom of truth, finally spoken. Yet as Avery stood in his office one particular evening, reviewing plans for expanding the archive, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Hidden in the margin of Cyrus Yarrow's original schematic, written in faded pencil, was a note he'd never seen before. Second manifold offsite, coordinates follow. The coordinates that followed pointed toward the railroad depot, where new construction had been underway for months. Construction that included extensive basement excavation and pneumatic infrastructure for modern ventilation systems. Avery walked to his window and looked out at the depot, where gas lamps illuminated workers finishing their evening shift. The building was larger than the Monarch, more centrally located, with direct connections to telegraph lines and federal mail routes. The curators of confidence had been stopped, Lenora Pike had been exposed, and the Monarch's secrets had been revealed. But as Avery stared at those coordinates and remembered Jonah's words about networks that made the hotel look like amateur theater, he realized their victory might have been only the first battle in a much longer war. The town had found its voice again. The question was whether it would be strong enough to keep it. In the archive below, Ledger stretched on his windowsill and opened one green eye, as if sensing that the hotel's work as a guardian of truth was far from finished. Some secrets, once disturbed, revealed only deeper mysteries beneath. The Monarch Hotel stood ready, its pneumatic heart beating with the rhythm of justice, prepared to amplify whatever voices needed to be heard in the battles yet to come.